There comes a point in every failed strategy when its architects stop promising victory and start praying for a miracle. In Ukraine, that miracle now appears to have a name: Russian internal collapse. Not battlefield success, not negotiations, not a clever diplomatic off-ramp. Collapse. And when collapse becomes your strategy, you're no longer playing chess. You're staring at the board and hoping your opponent has a heart attack. The latest argument making the rounds is simple enough. Europe's only realistic hope of defeating Russia in Ukraine may be to wait for Russia to break from within. This comes against a grim battlefield backdrop. Russian forces are pressing again in eastern Ukraine, especially around Kostiantynivka, one of the key towns in what's often called Ukraine's Donbas fortress belt. That's the chain of heavily defended cities running through places like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. If you control that belt, you control the military spine of Ukrainian-held Donbas. At the same time, European leaders have gathered in Armenia, where Yerevan is moving closer to the EU and further away from Moscow's orbit. Armenia is not Ukraine, but in geopolitics, nothing stays in its own box for very long. A small country trying to rebalance between Russia and the West can suddenly become the object of very large ambitions. Then there's the intelligence story. Reports say Kremlin security around Putin has tightened amid fears of assassination attempts, drone threats, internal leaks, and possible elite panic. Some of that may be real. Some may be propaganda. Some may be both, which is often how intelligence stories work. They arrive wearing a suit and carrying a fog machine. The question is not whether Moscow has security concerns. Of course it does. The question is whether the West has started mistaking those concerns for a winning strategy. Let's begin with what is true. Russia is under pressure. Not the sort of pressure that produces instant collapse, but pressure all the same. A long war drains manpower, money, logistics, equipment, political patience, and nerves. Moscow can pretend otherwise, but no state fights a major land war for years without paying for it somewhere. The Kremlin also has good reason to worry about Ukrainian long-range attacks. Drones have changed this war. They've made distance less comforting. They've turned oil depots, airfields, radar stations, and symbolic buildings into targets. A drone is not just a weapon. It is a message with propellers. And yes, if Putin's security has tightened, that would not be surprising. Russia has seen assassinations of military figures, sabotage incidents, drone strikes, and attacks inside its territory. Whether every detail in the latest intelligence reporting is true is another matter. But the broader point is credible. Wartime Moscow is not peacetime Moscow. The West also understands something important. Russia's center of gravity is political, as much as military. If the Kremlin loses elite cohesion, if the security services begin distrusting each other, if the public mood turns sharply, if regional elites start hedging, then the battlefield picture could change quickly. That's not fantasy. States can look stable until they don't. The Soviet Union itself was not defeated by NATO tanks rolling into Moscow. It decayed, stalled, overextended itself, and then watched its own political structure lose belief in itself. History does not repeat, but policymakers love pretending it sends them personal invitations. So the mainstream logic has a point. If Russia cracks internally, Ukraine's position improves dramatically. A divided Kremlin would struggle to sustain the war. A succession crisis would freeze decision-making. A nervous elite might seek a settlement. An exhausted population might become harder to mobilize. That's the optimistic theory. The problem is that theories are cheap. Reality charges interest. Russia has spent years adapting to sanctions. Its economy has not performed like the wreck Western officials predicted in 2022. It has pain, inflation, labor shortages, and distortion, especially because war production eats resources like a drunk at an open buffet. But collapse? No, not yet. The Russian state has also been very good at one thing: converting external pressure into internal discipline. The more openly the West says it wants Russia to break, the easier it becomes for Moscow to tell its public, "You see, this was never about Ukraine. This was about us." That message works, not on everyone, but on enough people. So yes, internal Russian instability matters. Yes, the West should watch it closely, but watching for cracks is analysis. Depending on them is policy written in pencil during a thunderstorm. Here's what strikes me about this whole argument. It reveals how narrow the Western menu has become. For years, the official line was that Russia could be defeated through sanctions, Ukrainian military resistance, Western weapons, diplomatic isolation, and time. Each part of that made some sense on paper. Sanctions would damage Russia's economy. Western weapons would raise the cost of Russia's advances. Diplomatic pressure would isolate Moscow. Time would favor Ukraine because the combined economies of the West are far larger than Russia's. That was the theory. But wars don't care how good your theory looked in PowerPoint. Russia absorbed the first sanctions shock. Ukraine fought with extraordinary courage, but paid an appalling price. Western weapons arrived, often late, often in limited quantities, and often with political caveats attached. Europe promised strategic autonomy, then discovered that strategic autonomy requires factories, ammunition stocks, and voters willing to pay for both. A minor administrative detail, apparently. Now Europe faces a hard truth. It does not want Russia to win. It does not want Ukraine to lose. It does not want to fight Russia directly. It does not want to pay indefinitely. It does not want to admit that its previous assumptions were too optimistic. And it does not have a clean path to victory. That leaves the hope of Russian internal collapse. But hope is not a plan. It's what you have when the plan is looking poorly. The comparison with Armenia is useful here. Armenia is moving closer to Europe, and many in Brussels will see this as a strategic gain. On a map, it looks attractive. Another state drifting away from Moscow, another piece loosened from Russia's regional influence. But Armenia has a problem. Its economy has been deeply tied to Russia through trade, migration, energy, and institutions like the Eurasian Economic Union. Moving westward may bring long-term opportunity, but it also brings immediate vulnerability. Armenia is landlocked, surrounded by difficult neighbors, and dependent on roots and relationships it cannot replace overnight. In plain terms, Brussels can invite Armenia to the party, but Moscow still knows where the electricity box is. That doesn't mean Armenia should stay under Russia's shadow forever. Countries have agency. Armenians have every right to choose their future. But great powers love treating small states as symbols. The small states then get the bill. Ukraine has been living that reality in the most brutal form. The West's strategic problem is that it keeps expanding the political contest with Russia while struggling to finish the military contest already underway. Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, energy corridors, sanctions enforcement, frozen assets, drone production, intelligence operations, all of it matters. But each added front creates another obligation. Russia, for all its many weaknesses, has a simpler objective: keep grinding until the other side's coalition frays. That is why the internal collapse idea is so revealing. It suggests some Western officials may understand that the current balance is not producing the outcome they need, so they look for a shortcut. Elite panic in Moscow, a coup scare, a drone attack that rattles the Kremlin, a succession struggle, another Prigozhin moment. Prigozhin's mutiny in 2023 matters because it showed that the Russian system could wobble. It also showed something else. The system could wobble and survive. That second part tends to get less airtime because it's less comforting. If your strategy depends on repeating the most dangerous weekend in modern Russian politics, you don't have a strategy. You have a lottery ticket with a think tank logo on it. So where does this go? The first scenario is the one Moscow wants: continued attrition. Russia keeps applying pressure across the front, especially in Donbass, while Ukraine tries to hold key urban positions and preserve manpower. If Kostiantynivka falls, the psychological and operational pressure on the rest of the fortress belt grows. It does not mean instant collapse. Cities do not fall like dominoes just because analysts enjoy the phrase, but it would matter. The second scenario is escalation by depth rather than by declaration. Ukraine keeps striking deeper into Russia. Russia keeps hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, ports, and rear areas. Both sides avoid calling it escalation because the word has become inconvenient, but the battlefield keeps expanding. The third scenario is political fatigue in the West. Not abandonment, necessarily. Something subtler. More delays. More arguments over funding. More conditions on weapons. More leaders giving dramatic speeches while defense ministries quietly check empty shelves. Europe has money, but money does not instantly become artillery shells. You cannot throw GDP at a trench. The fourth scenario is Russian internal stress. This is the one everyone wants to discuss because it is dramatic. Could it happen? Yes. Any wartime state can fracture. Russia has elite rivalries, corruption, regional tensions, military grievances, and economic distortions. It also has a political system built around one man, which means succession is always the monster under the bed. But could Western policy reliably produce that collapse? I doubt it. External pressure can weaken a state. It can also harden it. Sanctions can punish. They can also create new domestic winners who profit from isolation. Assassination fears can unsettle a leadership circle. They can also justify more repression, more secrecy, and more loyalty tests. There is a darker possibility too. If Moscow concludes that the West is actively seeking regime collapse, not just Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, then the Kremlin's incentive to compromise shrinks. Why make a deal with people you believe are waiting for your funeral? This is where intelligence leaks can become dangerous. They may be designed to rattle Moscow. They may be designed to reassure Western publics that something clever is happening behind the curtain, but they can also confirm the Kremlin's worst suspicions. And once both sides believe the other is aiming for regime survival rather than policy change, wars become much harder to end. That is the part most commentators underweight. The more this war becomes tied to the fate of governments, the less negotiable it becomes. Territory can be negotiated in theory. Security guarantees can be negotiated in theory. Sanctions relief can be negotiated in theory. Regime survival cannot. Nobody bargains politely over their own neck. The West has not found a secret strategy to defeat Russia. It has discovered the limits of its public strategy and is now flirting with the private hope that Russia solves the problem for them. That may sound harsh, but look at the pattern. Sanctions did not break Russia. Weapons did not restore Ukraine's full territorial position. Diplomatic isolation did not isolate Moscow globally. The Russian economy did not collapse on schedule. The global South did not line up obediently behind Brussels and Washington like schoolchildren waiting for lunch. So now the magic words are internal collapse. Could Russia collapse? Of course. Russia has done spectacular collapse before. Twice if we're being generous, and 3 times if we count some of the Tsar's more ambitious acts of self-harm. But serious policy cannot depend on your adversary having a nervous breakdown at a convenient hour. The West needs a clearer answer to a simple question. What is the achievable end state in Ukraine? Not the moral preference, not the conference slogan. The achievable end state. Because if the answer is, we wait until Moscow cracks, then we should be honest. That is not confidence. That is strategic insolvency dressed up as patience. And the bill, as usual, will be paid first by Ukrainians. When leaders stop explaining how they will win and start explaining why the enemy might collapse, something important has changed. The war has not ended. The strategy may have. If you found this useful, like and subscribe. There's more to come on this. Stay sharp.